Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Edison TV. Today we have as our guest Ian Crosbie, the CEO of Sequana Medical, giving us the latest update on the new developments at the company. Now, Sequana Medical is an emerging potential leader in the treatment of fluid overload. So, Ian, why do we need new treatments, and what therapeutic areas are you focusing on?
So fluid overload is something you probably haven't heard much about in other companies, but I'm sure everybody on this call has heard about heart failure, liver failure, and cancer. All of those large and growing markets have excess fluid in the body as a major clinical problem. For the last 30, 40 years, this fluid overload has been treated with drugs called diuretics, water pills, the pills that make you pee more. Major brand names there are things like Lasix and furosemide. These drugs are standard of care. They are now generic. There's no new innovative treatments along the way, and they are simple, easy to take, and standard of care. We are not trying to replace those drugs. The problem is that in a significant proportion of patients, they either stop working or they become intolerable for these patients. And when that happens, there is no good clinical alternative for these patients. So this leads to poor clinical outcomes, high treatment costs, and major impacts on quality of life for these patients. So that is where we are focusing. These are patients that have been forgotten. They fall outside of the mainstream, but they are a significant proportion of patients and a large and attractive commercial opportunity for us.
Okay. So what treatment options are you developing for these patients?
So we focus on two areas of fluid overload. The first area is where the fluid is built up and localized in the peritoneal cavity, the bag in your abdomen containing most of your organs. And the major cause we have there is a complication of liver cirrhosis. It doesn't matter how you attack your liver, whether you attack it with alcohol or you attack it with drugs or whether you attack it with fat, it causes the liver to leak, and the fluid leaks out of the liver. And these livers are leaking maybe 1 liter of fluid a day, builds up in the peritoneal cavity, and it can't go anywhere because that's a sealed bag. So that's our first treatment area, the treatment of liver ascites, where fluid is localized and builds up in the peritoneal cavity. The second area we are working is when the fluid is distributed all across the body, and that is very common in heart failure. All of your listeners will, of course, have heard of congestive heart failure. Congestion means generalized fluid buildup due to heart failure. So there's nowhere this time where we can take the fluid out from directly. We have to cleverly extract it from the whole body. So we have these two areas. We have a medical device approach to treating fluid where it is built up in the peritoneal cavity. It's localized and we pump it out. The second area is when the fluid is distributed across the body, and now we work in partnership with the kidneys for a drug therapy to reduce this generalized fluid overload in heart failure.
Well, starting with liver disease and ascites, maybe just reiterate to us how they're being treated today effectively, and how the company's lead product, the alfapump, how it can potentially provide benefit in these patients, and what sort of clinical evidence do you have supporting the effectiveness of the alfapump for this patient population?
So ascites, this is the fluid that leaks out of the liver. Initially, it's treated with diuretics, and when they stop working, it becomes known as recurrent or refractory ascites. And these patients are losing about 1 liter of fluid a day, builds up in the abdominal cavity. And standard of care, which was actually invented by the ancient Egyptians and really hasn't changed much since, is these patients accumulate 5 to 10 liters of fluid in the peritoneal cavity, and then they go to hospital where they then get drained over a 5 to 7 hour period. As you can imagine, it's a painful and burdensome procedure, and most importantly, it doesn't treat the problem. These patients just immediately start to build up the fluid again. So just imagine trying to function with say 5 to 10 liters of Evian shoved inside your abdomen. Imagine the weight of that, how you'd be out of balance. You couldn't breathe properly because your lungs would be depressed here. You couldn't eat properly, so constipated, vomiting, hard to breathe, hard to sleep, hard to move. That is the lifestyle of these patients. So standard of care for these patients is what's called drainage or paracentesis. If you take out more than 5 liters, it's known as large volume paracentesis. So a terrible burden on the life of these patients. And as soon as the patients are drained, the problem recurs. So these patients are coming into hospital every 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 8 weeks. But really, that day in hospital is bad, but also the period of time beforehand. It's incredibly hard for those patients to function. The buildup of fluid is not predictable, and it really does take away their life. So these patients need something better than a therapy from 2000 years ago. So what we do very simply is we have our high-tech implantable pump here, the alfapump, and you just see it on the Zoom here. This is implanted under the skin on the right-hand side below the rib cage. We put one catheter, this blue catheter, into the peritoneal cavity. We put the second catheter, the yellow catheter, into the bladder. And all that happens is this pump just automatically and continuously pumps this fluid, maybe a liter of this biological gunk a day, just automatically and continuously pumps it into the bladder, where the patient simply urinates it away. So the patient has no buildup of fluid in the abdomen, and they can go about their life without the burden of this fluid overload, without the burden of this fluid accumulation, and without the burden of these regular trips to hospital. These patients get their life back. These are admittedly late stage patients, so they're not going to be running the Olympics here, but it gives them the freedom to do the things they want to do, go and visit their grandchildren, go to family weddings, do those travel they've always wanted to do. This is what these patients deserve in life. Historically, the major driver of liver cirrhosis has been alcohol abuse or viral hepatitis. This is now changing with the advent of fatty liver disease and NASH, or MASH as it's now being caused. So the overwhelming driver in the United States is now being driven by obesity. So it's changing a lot of the profile of the patient group here. So now we're seeing patients more in the 60s plus in stable family groups. So these are people that have worked all their life. They're used to paying their taxes, voting, and high standards of healthcare. So now they are demanding a 21st century solution. And that is why we believe we were granted breakthrough designation by FDA for this device. There's great enthusiasm among the clinical community we see for a better treatment option. They don't want to be forcing these patients or these people who have been used to modern healthcare back to this sort of barbaric form of medicine. They want something which is compatible with modern life. So that is what the Alpha Pump provides. And the clinical evidence we provided from our pivotal study, the POSEIDON study, this was being conducted over the past few years in US and Canada. And in these patients, what we did is we took patients who were used to being drained and we put the Alpha Pump in. And what we were looking for is how much reduction can we get in the need of external drainage in these patients? And what we saw in the patients we treated is we saw a 100% median reduction in the need for external drainage in these patients. So basically, as one of our investigators described it, it's the virtual elimination of needle drainage. So transforming these patient lives there. We saw a clinically significant and statistically meaningful improvement in quality of life of these patients as well. And when we compared this to this patients who are on the standard of care, we saw no difference in the safety profile here. So what we see in these patients is, with a comparable safety profile, we can get rid of this terrible burden of recurrent drainage and deliver an improvement in quality of life. And although the study was not powered for survival, because it was a relatively small study, we saw what was a very exciting indication of survival, with a 70% chance of survival based on a Kaplan-Meier analysis at 18 months, which compares very favorably to what we've seen in the literature here already. So we believe this is a very exciting clinical profile and commercial profile for these patients.
And so, in terms of the next step, because I believe that Sequana just very recently submitted a PMA, a pre-marketing approval application. This brings us to the consideration for commercialization, particularly in the vital US market. How does Sequana plan to commercialize the alpha pump in this
Yeah,
market?
so PMA was a real milestone of the company. It's what, ever since I took over running the company, we've been focused upon here. So doing so was a tremendous achievement, and obviously with a PMA application gives us a very strong potential regulatory position in the United States. So we submitted it at the end of 2023. So we are anticipating approval by the end of 2024. And we now plan to commercialize this product in the US and Canada ourselves. There is no existing medical device sales force targeted upon the hepatology community that we can leverage. So we will build that sales force ourselves. But what enables us to do this is these patients that start producing ascites, there is no cure for this decompensated cirrhosis. Therefore, the only cure is a liver transplant. So all of these patients have to be evaluated for a transplant at one of the approximately 100 liver transplant centers in the United States. So therefore, we can focus our commercial efforts on this narrow group of hospitals. So a very sophisticated group of hospitals with a very sophisticated set of physicians there. And we believe there's a great willingness there to adopt this new technology. It's estimated that 3 out of 4 of these patients get turned down for a liver transplant. So we can either become a destination therapy for those patients who will not be receiving a liver transplant, or for those patients who are going to be on the waiting list for a year or two, we can become a bridge to therapy, making sure that these patients stay in a good physical and mental condition to make sure that they are in the best possible state to receive what is a very scarce organ and an expensive procedure there. So we believe it's an exciting way, and with a sales force of approximately 50 people, we believe we can target this market. We've done an analysis of the number of patients who are repeatedly drained in the United States and Canada for liver cirrhosis. And what we see is there's about 80,000 patients currently in the US and Canada who are drained at least 3 times a year because of their liver cirrhosis. 1/4 of those patients, so about 20,000 patients, is drained every month. So those patients, those 20,000 patients, are our core target market initially. These patients have a high cost, they're a terrible clinical burden, and they're the only real competition for us is that drainage. So therefore, we believe that's a market that is very ripe for development from a commercial point of view. As we penetrate that market, we then plan to move into those patients who get drained every other month, which is another 20,000 patients. So this is a market that, based upon our estimated pricing of $25,000 to $35,000 for the device, represents up to 1.4 billion of market opportunity for the alpha pump. And this market is forecast to grow at 6 to 7% a year moving forward, primarily driven by the very strong growth in fatty liver disease and NASH in the US and Canada.
And so that's a very strong overview for the alpha pump, but we also know that the Sequana is working on heart failure. So, looking at heart failure, can you tell us a bit more about cardiorenal syndrome and what is the current challenge in the market and what is currently being done to treat cardiorenal syndrome?
So as we were talking to clinicians about the opportunities in liver, in fluid overload, people obviously say, well, what about heart failure? Congestive heart failure is one of the biggest costs for Medicare today. It's estimated that it is the number 2 cost for Medicare in the over 65s is the cost of hospitalization for acute decompensated heart failure patients. There are 1 million hospitalizations a year in the United States for heart failure, and of that, 90% are due to symptoms of fluid overload. The fluid this time, it does not build up in the abdomen, it builds up all across the body. But one of the areas that it does exhibit clinical problems is the fluid builds up in the lungs and the patients feel they are drowning. So as I said, 90% of these 1 million hospitalizations is driven by symptoms of fluid overload. And these patients are typically admitted into the emergency room. Average length of stay is 5 days, and the cost of all these hospitalizations is over $14 billion a year. So a huge burden. The problem is that these patients, the standard of care for treating these patients is diuretics, and the strongest version of these diuretics are called loop diuretics, and in hospital they're given intravenously. The problem is that half of these patients leave hospital with no clinically relevant loss of weight. The doctors treat them to the best case they can, but when it comes to to discharge, half of the patient is discharged at the same weight. They've lost no fluid during their period of time there, and therefore it's no surprise that 1 in 4 of these patients is readmitted within 30 days of discharge, creating a huge cost for the healthcare system today. And back to the question about cardiorenal syndrome, the heart and the kidney work in a very close link. So when the heart doesn't pump properly, the kidney doesn't get enough blood, and the kidney then can't do its job properly, and it compensates by accumulating sodium. And all of us on this call have roughly the same concentration of sodium in our bloodstream, about 135 millimoles per liter. So if we accumulate sodium, we have to accumulate fluid to maintain that balance. And this builds up all over the body. So you see people with big swollen arms, legs, thoraxes. And that extra fluid puts extra burden on the heart. So the heart pumps poorly again, which leads to the kidney retaining more sodium and the problem getting worse. So this is the challenge of cardiorenal syndrome. An impact on the heart leads to an impact on the kidney, leads to an impact on the heart. So the only way for standard of care, the primary way of getting rid of this volume is by using these strong doses of these loop diuretics. The problem is these drugs, while managing volume, in some patients almost universally damages the kidney, leading to damage on the kidney, which leads to the kidney retaining more sodium, leads to the kidney retaining more volume. So this cardiorenal syndrome has a real problem, and there is no really good effective treatments out there, with loop diuretics having to pay the price for the kidney having to pay the price for controlling the volume. So what we have shown with our so-called DSR therapy, our direct sodium removal therapy, is an alternative route to attack this accumulation of fluid without needing loop diuretics. So what we do is a very simple approach, which is, ever since we left the ocean, the kidney and brain have developed a very strong mechanism to stop ourselves getting dehydrated. So the kidney will not give up sodium voluntarily. So what we do is we go in and we put a sodium-free solution into the peritoneal cavity, and we draw sodium out of the body, bypassing the kidney. So we suck sodium from the body, maybe removing 5 to 10 grams. The kidney and the brain now sees this reduction in sodium in the body very quickly and accurately, and the kidney steps in, realizing that there is too much water in the body and not enough sodium, does the only thing it can do, which is eliminate water from the body, does so by ultrafiltration and urination, and restoring the balance quickly, accurately, and safely, but also reducing that fluid overload. And what we have shown in our studies, we've completed studies, the Red Desert and Sahara studies in the Republic of Georgia. We're now conducting the studies in the United States, the so-called MOJAVE study. And in that study, we have shown that we can take patients on high doses of loop diuretics, patient doses well above the average dose here. The typical dose is 20 to 40 milligrams. In our current study, we treated patients up to 1.6 grams a day of loop diuretics. We have stopped their loop diuretics completely, and we have replaced that with DSR therapy for approximately 4 weeks. And what we have found is at the end, during that 4-week period, we can maintain their fluid balance safely and effectively. If patients are overloaded, we can get rid of as much water as we want out of these patients safely and effectively. And during the drug therapy, the DSR therapy, we maintain their fluid balance. But what's really surprising is when we stop our DSR therapy after 4 weeks, patients continue to be able to maintain their fluid balance with minimal doses of loop diuretics going forward. In the most recent MOJAVE study, we've seen patients reduce their need for loop diuretics by 95 to 100% for up to 4 months post-therapy. The study we did in Sahara and Red Desert, we saw patients off or down to minimal doses of diuretics for up to 12 months. So we see this very long duration in resetting of the cardiorenal syndrome post-treatment with DSR. So these patients are now on minimal doses of loop diuretics, very well maintained volume, which translates into a much better cardiorenal profile. And what we saw in the patients in Georgia, Republic of Georgia, was that we saw a 1-class improvement in their heart failure status. And based upon a highly validated model for predicting survival in these patients, the Seattle heart failure model, we saw a 75% reduction in predicted mortality at 1 year in these patient groups. So a highly exciting opportunity here for these patients who have this fluid overload despite high doses of loop diuretics. We offer the potential here to manage their disease in a much better manner, get rid of these drugs, these loop diuretics, which are perceived by the clinical community universally as a form of poison. It's a necessary evil because there are no other options, but now we allow the body to manage the disease itself by resetting the cardiorenal syndrome, enabling the heart and the kidney to improve the health of both organs, and in doing so, restore the ability of the body to manage fluid balance, reduce the heart failure, and potentially improve the survival of this very large and expensive patient group. These patients are costing, we believe these patients are costing about $50,000 a year in hospital costs alone. So based upon the estimated 200,000 patients in the United States who are admitted repeatedly for congestive heart failure, that amounts to a hospital bill of $10 billion a year. So imagine there's a similar number in Europe, similar number in Japan, much larger numbers over in Asia. We see a huge commercial opportunity for DSR as a disease-modifying drug therapy tackling cardiorenal syndrome and diuretic-resistant heart failure.
Well, I think just very recently you announced it for that Mojave study that the DMSB has approved the progression of that study to the next phase, to the randomized phase. Is that correct?
Absolutely right. So the Mojave study was the first time we've used DSR therapy in the United States. And because of that, the FDA wanted us to have a safety run-in. They wanted us to treat the first 3 patients at a single site and to review the safety data of these patients. And in these patients, what we did is we stopped their loop diuretic dose. They were on very high doses of loop diuretics. We stopped their loop diuretics. We treated them for 4 weeks. We saw this virtual elimination of loop diuretics. And we had to go back to this independent data safety monitoring board. So an independent group of highly experienced physicians. They reviewed the safety data, and having reviewed that data, they've now approved the progression of the study into the randomized control phase. So very exciting for us. Now we can compare, there'll be a study of up to 30 patients, 20 patients treated with DSR therapy, and 10 patients treated with intravenous loop diuretics. 4 weeks of treatment, followed by 3 months of follow-up here. If we see the same results in the randomized patients that in the DSR treated patients that we saw in the roll-in patients, we believe we'll see a very clear distinction versus what we see in the control group here. And if the results are repeated, then we believe this is very validated as a new therapy for cardiorenal syndrome. We expect initial data to be reported in Q4 of this year, and then the top line data to be reported in Q4 of 2025. Upon the release of that data, we are planning to partner this program with a major player in the heart failure space, because heart failure is an enormous market. There are many players who have an established presence in this market. So we believe the best way to get this breakthrough therapy to the broadest acceptance in the community and to realize the benefits is to do that with a partner. So this time we're looking for a partnering transaction sometime during the course of 25 or beginning of 26, once we have the strong data reported from the Mojave program. So exciting times for our DSR program as well here.
Excellent. And what are the upcoming milestones that we should look forward to for Sequana?
So coming up, we submitted the PMA. Was exciting at the end of at the end of last year and reporting the initial data from the MOJAVE patients. So next milestones coming up are going to be FDA approval for the alfapump, which we expect by Q4 of this year. And on the heart failure side, we expect, now we've been given the approval to kick off the randomized phase, we expect to see data from the first patients in the randomized phase of MOJAVE in Q4 of this year. And then obviously beyond there, repeating the data in 25 and partnering. So some really bold clinical and regulatory milestones for us this year. Liver, it's all about preparing for commercialization in the United States. Heart failure, it's all about building the clinical package in anticipation of a partnering deal for heart failure, and probably in late 25.
Well, it's an exciting period coming up for Sequana Medical, and thank you very much for joining us today, Ian, and we look forward to future updates on the company's progress. Thank you again.
Hey, Priya, thank you very much, and thank you to the Edison team.